Before I begin, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat people, and is the now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Dish with One Spoon, Territory, and the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We offer these acknowledgements on behalf of all our speakers today. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Good evening, everyone. Ya Ali Madad. We are delighted to host you tonight at the Smiley Center, Toronto, in collaboration with the Institute of Smiley Studies and ITRP Canada. My name is Rosina Samani, and I have the privilege of serving you as your host for the evening. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and a special welcome and thank you to everyone joining us live on this Smiley TV. We are delighted to share this event with you. I must say, when you hear the phrase book launch, you might expect something dramatic, like fireworks or a countdown before someone literally launches a book across the room. But do not worry. We have confirmed with the safety team that today's launch will be entirely metaphorical. On the other hand, we would like to call this event a book release, as today, the book by Dr. Ali Asani, Living Islam, Muslim Expressions of Faith, will be explored by our esteemed group of panelists and available to all of us to take a copy home. This book invites us to explore many ways Muslims across cultures, geographies, and histories understand and experience their faith through art, language, poetry, ritual, and the lived experiences that give life to spiritual expression. We are delighted that this evening brings together scholars who have deeply engaged with these themes and who will help us reflect on Islam not just as a monolith, but as a vibrant tapestry of traditions and interpretations. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a truly illuminating evening of conversation. Again, a warm welcome to all who have joined us virtually through the Smiley TV live telecast of this event. The format of this evening event would be a moderated discussion and followed by a Q&A. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator of the evening, Alisha Kurji. Alisha is the Chief Operating Officer at Bayview Group. She's a leader in a commercial real estate with a deep commitment to building inclusive communities. As a proud mother of three, she champions diversity and works to dismantle stereotypes, helping to bridge divides and ensure future generations can thrive. She will attempt to bring a thoughtful lens to the conversation at the intersection of faith, culture, and education. She will guide today's dialogue and introduce our distinguished speakers, Dr. Alnoor Dhanani and Dr. Hussein Rashid. Please join me in welcoming Alisha Kurji.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Hello and Ya Ali Madad. It is an immense pleasure to welcome you all this evening as we explore Dr. Ali Asani's latest work in his book, Living Islam, alongside two distinguished scholars, Dr. Alnoor Dhanani and Dr. Hussein Rashid. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to say a few words about the author, whose insights shaped tonight's discussion. Dr. Asani, Harvard's Murray A. Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Indo-Muslim Cultures, has spent decades helping audiences toward a deeper and richer understanding of Muslim experience, and is the recipient of the Harvard Foundation Medal for his contributions to improving intercultural and race relations, along with many other accolades and published works. His book, Living Islam, continues that tradition beautifully. In clear and inviting language, Dr. Asani shows Islam as a multicolored tapestry, woven from history, culture, and the diverse ways communities express their faith. It's accessible, insightful, and a great starting point to this conversation. This evening, we're fortunate to explore the themes of the book with two distinguished scholars, Dr. Alnoor Dhanani and Dr. Hussein Rashid. Dr. Alnoor Dhanani is a historian of Muslim intellectual history with a focus on interactions between science, religion, and philosophy. He has taught at Boston area institutions and the Institute of Ismaili Studies, playing a key role in the IIS STEP teacher training program and secondary curriculum. His research explores Muslim responses to ideas like Big Bang cosmology in historical and contemporary contexts. And Dr. Hussein Rashid, as he approaches the stage here, he thrives as a free-range academic, currently at Barnard College. He has led initiatives like Project Director for the Arts of Devotion at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art, and published widely on Muslims in the US across academic and creative spaces. He believes in bridging the work of academia with public service and has served on museum projects, operas, and documentary productions. Just a little housekeeping before we dive into this exciting conversation ahead. You'll notice that you have cue cards and pencils on your seats. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if our brilliant scholars here spark any questions, I'm sure they surely will. Please jot them down. We'll collect them a bit later. So to kick off our discussion, can you both tell us why this book is so important today?
So just to add a little bit about myself and my relationship with the author, I have known the author since both of us were undergraduates. So he was at Harvard and I was at Columbia. And so we had this New York-Boston connection that for those of you who live in the area know very well about. So that's how long I have known Ali, and it's a pleasure for me to be here to discuss his book with you today. This is just a photograph of the author, the front page of the book, and a little bit about the contents, and I hope you get a chance to look at the book from this event. So this book, in a very large sense, asks the question of how do we talk about what is Islam? Who or what is a Muslim? Who makes those decisions? And how ought we think about reflectively as to whether the way these things are discussed really reflect, as he calls it, living Islam. So let me stop here and ask my colleague Hussein to add his own few words about that.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Yali Madad. I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me here and putting this all together. It is a privilege and an honor to be on stage with a friend and mentor, Alnoor Dhanani, speaking about Ali Asani's book. Ali Asani I met when I was 16 years old and a participant at Aluma. He was director of the Aluma program. I met his brother Kareem when he was a counselor the following year. Meeting Ali and Alnoor changed my trajectory from being a medical doctor to being a doctorate in Islamic studies, where Ali was my graduate school advisor. So I've known him not quite as long as Alnoor, but a significant amount of my life, at least. And he introduced me a lot to the methodology that he brings into this book, this idea of religious literacy. I've spent the last 2 years of my life in a program dedicated to critical religious literacy, and am continuing to live that work. And he also talks, that is, Ali also talks about this idea of cultural studies. And I think what is important about this book, as he talks about cultural studies, is this idea that we tend to think of religion in isolation. Oh, this is religion and this is culture. And what cultural studies forces us to do is to say, religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a time and in a place, and we have to think about questions of gender and class and race, ability, language. What does that mean? Why do certain things sound different in English than they do in Arabic or Persian or Urdu or Gujarati, right? What is the flavor that changes when we think about this? So I think this is really what the invitation is how do we take this seriously? Not to say religion and culture are separate, because what is a pure religion except a fantasy? But to really think about, when we talk about religion, what does this mean in a particular time, place, and with particular people?
So there are two positions that the author critiques in very strong language, I would think. The first one is that Islam is defined by correct practice, which means following 5 pillars. And that if you follow 5 pillars, then you're following Islam, Muslim. In a sense that, is that a sufficient definition of saying who is a Muslim, what is Islam? So that's his first critique. And the second critique is that if Muslims are engaged in anything good or bad, mostly bad, it is due to their faith. It has nothing to do with their economic status, conflict in the countries that they come from, nothing to do with colonialism, with racism. It just has to do with their faith. And I think with this cultural studies approach and the way of presenting that, we need to think about religion apart from just what its text says, or what those who take on the mantle of let us tell you what the text says, not just from within the tradition, but from outside the tradition, because I'm sure you see every day on media, whether it is print media, whether it is television media, that people are trying to tell you this is who Muslims are, this is what they do, without actually looking at real Muslims.
I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that Ali doesn't get to in the book, but I think I know was very important to him as part of this intellectual project, is that knowing a cultural context does not excuse or absolve people of making moral decisions or making moral judgments. But it is a way of illuminating how people are making decisions that we understand for context, that we look to explain, and we can say that did colonialism have an impact in certain Muslim countries? Yes, 100% we can say that. Did that impact the economy of those countries? Yes. Did it impact gender roles in those countries? Yes, it did. But that doesn't mean that it excuses poor treatment of women. That doesn't mean it excuses questions of hoarding of wealth, right? These are things that are antithetical to other Muslim understandings of Islam. And so I don't want us thinking that by adding context or by adding nuance, we're seeking to excuse, but we're actually seeking to understand more clearly why certain things are happening and how best we can respond to them in intellectually, ethically, and morally sophisticated ways, rather than throw our hands up and say, oh, that's them and this is us. But to say, this is all us, and what is our moral responsibility, right? And this is very much in line with also, I would argue, Muslim ethics, or Muslim ethical thinking, that, somebody asks the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, and says, the Prophet says, you are not a believer until you wish for your brother, that is your fellow in religion, what you wish for yourself. And they asked the Prophet, well, what about the oppressor? Your obligation to the oppressor is to stop them oppressing. It's not to say, let the oppressor oppress. And so I really think that there is part of this conversation as well that has a deeply internal ethical component to it as well.
So I think that when we take cultural context seriously, and I think another part, we all know this. We all know that when we were young, we liked one kind of music, our kids like a kind of music that we can't stand, let's say. And we understand that culture and, just life, there's change. And I think it's very important to recognize that those kinds of analysis that we bring into the discussion of culture are also the kinds of analysis that belong to religion. So we accept that cultures are geographic, they are temporal, they change with time, they have diverse modes of artistic expression. And you can ask yourself, well, isn't that true for religion also? And I think that is, in a way, part of the cultural studies project that Ali Asani engages in. Professor Asani. Sorry, I call him Ali because I have the, I think, right for having known him for so long to say that. But the minute you recognize this idea of dynamism and change and the role of context, then it's obviously no-brainer to recognize that there is going to be diversity, because how change happens in one place and how change happens in another place, what the original cultural context is one place, what it affects it in terms of trade, let's say, are very different. And so central portion of his argument is that religious diversity is a given. And I think, Hussein, I know you were interested in biology at some point in your career path, but for those of you who know roses, you know the multiple variety of roses we have is the diversity. And this is the diversity that, if you think of it, allows you to have multiple kinds of perfume and fragrance. So I don't want to stretch my example, but I do want to say that how we should, in a way, value our diversity. Think of what it does. And I think, in a sense, even though Ali discusses to the later parts of his book the role of the arts, where you see this is an important part of diversity in art that brings us this particular richness and tapestry, as you talked about. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of Islam where people talk loudly and some people...
Before we get into the loud and silent Islam, I think as you're talking about roses, and I don't know if this is intentional on your part or not, but the Prophet is described as having the scent of roses. And there was a CD that had come out, must have been in the late 90s, Devotionals to the Prophet Muhammad. It was a fundraising CD for children survivors of the Bosnian genocide. And it was a scratch and sniff CD. So, the one side was the songs, but then if you scratched it, the printed side, it smelled like roses to remind you of the Prophet and prophetic mercy. And so as you're thinking of roses, the idea of the prophetic scent being that of roses. And this, for me, is this idea of silent and loud Islam. And there are several authors who talk about this and give it different valences. But thinking about the way most Muslims live their lives is a very silent type of Islam. They live their lives in a way that makes sense to them, that they were brought up by their parents, by their grandparents, by their community, and thinking about how they understand their Islam and what it means for them to be living as Muslim, versus you talked about media voices, who it is we actually hear, right? And I don't want to say the squeaky wheel, but I think there is a particular, because it's not a squeaky wheel, it is a play into stereotypes of the Muslim as the bearded man, or the muhajjaba, that is the woman who wears a hijab. But what about all the other people who are sitting quietly, who don't have time to be on, in the US I would say CNN, I don't know what the equivalent is here, to be honest with you, but I can make reference to CNN as a USian, okay. Who don't have time to go on CNN because they've got to make a living, they've got to go to work, right? And they've got to live their lives. Or they're actually going out and doing community service, and instead of complaining about the lack of food in their community, going out and doing the work to get food into their communities, right? And thinking about how do we take loud Islam seriously when it is in part manufactured, I would argue is in part manufactured, versus the silent Islam, which is the way most, again, Muslims would live their lives.
I'm reminded here of the empty drum that makes the loudest voice. And I would add to media, social media, that these are the voices where clicks amplify the sound. So we need to be kind of mindful that are we really listening with another kind of ear to the ethics of how do they behave, what kind of generosity. So that becomes the silentest thing. But I did want to, just to take a little bit of time, go back to the rose. So a few years ago, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Iran. And the area of Iran called Kashan is where they produce rose perfume. And they have a particular rose that they call Gulle Muhammad. Okay? So you were talking about the
Gul Muhammad meaning the rose of Muhammad.
The rose of Muhammad. And the rose of Muhammad is supposedly the most beautiful fragrance of a rose you could get. And the reason for it is that during the Miraj, the night journey of the Prophet, one of his sweat drops fell on a rose. And that made it, that fragrance. So we have these wonderful stories, but those stories are, in a sense, reminding us of who the Prophet is. I think that's a good segue for you.
No, that's perfect. Your reflections really do bring that rich tapestry to life. In the book, the author does focus quite a bit on the centrality of the Prophet. So maybe you both can just speak to like why does he focus so much on the centrality of the Prophet?
So I think one of the things I remember very clearly being Ali's student is he used to give these lectures on the Prophet, and he would do it through two ways. He would say the Prophet in history, that is, who's the historical Muhammad? You know, he was born in such and such time. These were his parents, his family, and so on. When did he receive revelation, and so on. And then he would talk about the Prophet through history. And why does the Prophet take on such an important role in Muslim lives, right? So the way I think about it is that first and foremost, the Prophet is considered the most perfect Muslim by virtue of being the Prophet. So if we want to think about what it means to behave as a Muslim, the first reference point is the Prophet. How did the Prophet behave? Because the Prophet knew how to behave because he was the Prophet. He receives revelation. He has this relationship with the divine. The Quran calls him Uswatan Hasana, the most beautiful role model, right? That the Prophet is meant to be this beautiful role model. The Prophet is also, the Quran talks about the Prophet, the angels calling salawat upon the Prophet, these blessings. So when we say the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, this is a Quranic injunction that you do this because the angels do it. This is what is expected. This is what is done for us. And the Prophet is also described as an intercessor, which is something we'll talk a little bit about later. But the Prophet is described as an intercessor, somebody who has this particular relationship with the divine that we can turn to in order for our own elevation of our souls, our own connection with the divine. We can turn to the Prophet fulfills some of that position for us. So I think the Prophet, historically, theologically, has served this really important position for Muslim communities.
So we have all this diversity in Islam that we mentioned a little earlier, but the unifying figure is the Prophet. But of course, the Prophet is understood in diverse ways, culturally diverse ways. So that's what's, in a way, it's the glue that holds us together, but it's also the diversity that binds us in a way. So that's very important. And Hussein, I just wanted to emphasize what you said, but you left one part out, is the Quranic ayat is God and the angels
God in the air, yes.
offer blessings on the Prophet. All believers offer blessings and peace. So you can see here that even God in this Quranic ayat, So this is why when Mulana Sultan Ahmad Shah, our 40th Imam, mentions that the most beautiful prayer is the prayer of praise on the Prophet, right? And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, in a hadith, people ask the Prophet that God has asked us to offer blessings on you. How should we do that? And so the Prophet says, you should say, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin Ali Muhammad. You all know that, most of you. Kama salaita, as you offered blessings on Abraham and the family of Abraham. So in this, you can see the kind of binding of the Muslim communities and all the Abrahamic communities, because the notion of prophecy is the same across both.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Dr. Rashid, you mentioned intercession. I'd love to, dig deeper into that. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
what role does the Prophet have peace upon him?
Just before I talk about intercession, just a word on the slide that's up on the screen right now. The book cover you see on your left is Celebrating Muhammad, Images of the Prophet in Popular Muslim Poetry. And this was a book co-authored by Ali and Kamal Abdul Malik, looking at devotional poetry of the Prophet. Ali was writing about devotional poetry of the Prophet in Indic contexts, particularly in Sindhi poetry, and Abdul Malik was writing about it in Egyptian poetry. But this has obviously been a figure of the fascination of devotion to the Prophet has been something that has been important to Ali's intellectual work for some time. And his advisor, Anne-Marie Schimmel, is the book on the right, and Muhammad is his messenger, is a book dedicated to both Muhammad in history and through history, thinking about the theology and devotion to the Prophet, again, through multiple different languages, multiple different cultural contexts. So there is this ongoing discussion that he's entering into.
I just wanted to, since we were talking about the Prophet, and Professor Asani was very interested in the arts. In fact, the third chapter of his book is called The Multisensory Approach to Islam, which is all about arts. But I'd like to make a plug for the museum, shout out for the museum. I don't get any funding from them. But they have this wonderful exhibit going on right now, which is, as you can see, as the sun appears from beyond, 20 years of the Al-Burda Award, which is on till February 18th. And my recommendation for those of you who are excited about what we're talking about today, I hope some of you are, is you need to read Professor Asani's book and then go to this exhibit. It's riveting, it's very well done, and it will really expose you to the calligraphic arts and in the way we think about the Prophet expressed in the Quran through calligraphy. And I have one more slide that is actually not the one at the museum, but similar to that. We all know about the 99 names of Allah, right? But this is about, in a way, the veneration of the Prophet. It's called the Hilya, the qualities, the noble qualities of the Prophet. And you can see at the top it starts with the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The calligraphy, then there is a medallion in which all of the different ways of venerating the Prophet are described. And right in the middle is another Quranic verse which says that we have not sent you but as a mercy to all the worlds. And I think that's a wonderful way to start talking about
The
intercession.
Prophet, yeah. The idea of Rahmat al-Alameen, this idea of mercy to the worlds, right? So we've experienced, we've heard about God and the angels calling these the salawat upon the Prophet, that the Prophet is a mercy to the worlds. And because of this love that Muslims are imbued with, that is cultivated within them for the Prophet, and in many instances the Prophet's family, that to turn to the Prophet, to turn to the Prophet's family for this barakah, for these blessings, is really very, very normal. This is the first step towards intercession. So when I say turning towards barakah, I want to I have a brief audio clip. This is a qawwali. This is from, qawwali is a devotional art form from South Asia, from a Sufi order known as the Chishtis. This particular qawwali is done by the Sabri brothers and is for the Prophet's wet nurse, Halima. And so this is the coming of the, this is saying the Prophet is coming to sit in your lap, and so there, the blessings of this upon you that will spread throughout the world. So why don't we just play that?
अपने जारी फरमान किया रेगिस्तान अरब को जिसने रश्क बहारिस्तान किया जश्न जश्न मनाओ कुदरत ने हर मुश्किल को आसान किया अर्श ने ये खुशखबरी भेजी ज़मीन ने ये ऐलान किया अब्दुल्ला के घर से जहां में नूर बिखरने वाला है अब्दुल्ला के घर से जहां में नूर बिखरने वाला है दाई हलीमा गोद में तेरी चाँद करने वाला है दाई हलीमा
As though I performed it myself and it wasn't a recording from the 1970s. MashaAllah, thank you. Okay, so I just want to say a word about that, because if you as you were looking at the lyrics, right, it's this idea that the angels and the huris, these divine heavenly beings, are swaying to and fro. The gardens are about to bloom, coming back to this rose imagery, right? These hints, these allusions, these things that you're expected to know as you engage with it. And then it's about Dai Halima, the moon is about to descend in your lap, right? The moon is an image used for the prophet. He's as radiant as the moon. This comes up in the Hilyas quite a bit, that his face is as radiant as the moon, and he's described as the moon. So you have all these illusions, and the idea of proximity to the prophet brings you blessings, even if that proximity is not by blood. The closer you come to the prophet through relationship, then the more elevated you are. And one of the things I'm fascinated by this tradition, sorry, a quick digression. So I have to tell you a story about this Qawwali. So I was a graduate student when I discovered this album, and I was teaching for Ali. We were actually putting together his course on Islam through the arts, called For Love of God and His Prophet. And I shared it with Ali, and he said, "Oh, this is wonderful. Why don't you write up the translation for it, and we'll use it in class?" So I started doing the translation. My doctoral work was on Qawwali. I started doing the translation. I've spent a week on this at this point. You know, if you don't know Qawwali, they're quite long. This is, you've heard like the first bit, right? This goes on for another 20 minutes. And so I've spent like about a week on this, and I'm getting through it, and I'm getting stuck, and I keep going back to it. And then finally I open up the liner notes, if for those of you who remember what liner notes are. And of course there's a full set of translations right there. And I'm just like, I've just wasted a week of my life. And Ali was so pleased that he didn't have to deal with my translations anymore. And he said, "But we're going to use the first 2 minutes." And I'm like, you could have said that earlier. But it was wonderful. But every time we played this in class, people would start clapping, even if they didn't understand the language, because it's infectious. And we have to understand these traditions to this point of being multisensory, is that it is in your ear, it is referencing things you already know, these illusions, and it is embodied, right, that keep coming up. And the Hilya tradition is a description of the prophet that emerges. But what do we do about representations, pictorial representations of the prophet? And I think one of the things that this is really useful to think about method and approaches is not does Islam forbid pictures of the prophet, because Islam is not a person, but why do certain Muslims prohibit representations of the prophet, and in what contexts? So thinking about representations of the prophet visually versus through the Hilya tradition versus orally, how that all comes into place, because these are all representations of the prophet, right? Do not be confused. Simply because you're not using your eyes, it doesn't mean it's not a representation of the prophet. So understanding how that comes in, what types of representations do Muslims find acceptable? So when it comes to questions of intercession, you thought I'd forgotten the question. When it comes to questions of intercession, right, the intercession is this idea that if I have done something, that I need to go to somebody else, right? So if I've erred against Alisha, rather than seeking Alisha's forgiveness directly because of whatever relationship we have, I go through another party. I would go through Alnoor, for example, to say, "Can you please intercede with Alisha on my behalf?" And the Quran is replete with notions of intercession. This is very common. There's one verse of the Quran that says, "O Prophet, if those who had done wrong had simply but come to you and asked for forgiveness, surely they would have found God forgiving," right? So very explicitly, you go to the Prophet for intercession, and if the Prophet forgives you, God will forgive you. But we also ask, when we do the salawat, to say the Prophet to then commend us to God on the Day of Judgment. There's another very well-known verse from the Quran that an Ismaili Dai or missionary or caller to the faith by the name of Nasir Khosrow talks about as part of his conversion narrative to Ismailism, where the Quran says, "Indeed, those who swear allegiance to you," that is to the Prophet, "those who swear allegiance to you swear allegiance only to Allah. The hand of Allah is above their hands. So whoever breaks their oath breaks it not only to their own detriment, and whoever breaks it only to their own detriment, and whoever fulfills the promise they've made with God, God will give them a great reward," right? So this idea that by making a promise to the Prophet, you're making the promise to God. It is the Prophet is serving as an intercessor. And for Nasir Khosrow, he says, once the Prophet is passed who is there, he turns to the Ahlul Bayt. So we see this continuity of intercession then also continuing through the Prophet's family, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, what we call the awliya, or the friends of God, in other contexts. But this idea of intercession is incredibly, incredibly important in Muslim traditions.
So we have on screen one of the things that I think earlier on, because Asani had talked about, is when we look at these different stories of Islam. The stories that we don't hear about are the ones that are marginal. And when you think about Islam in your own education, the way it is represented in media, you're looking at the Islam that is the Islam of the Middle East, maybe Iran, maybe South Asia. But Africa, West Africa, Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country, you don't hear much about what kind of Islam they have. So here we have a poem by Asma bint Shehu from the Sokoto Caliphate. Now, I made a plug for the museum. I'm going to make a plug for the IIS secondary curriculum. So one of the most recent volumes to come out is called Connecting Worlds. And it covers basically from about 1800s to the beginning of the First World War. So within that falls this West African movement called the Sokoto Caliphate. And in this Sokoto Caliphate, one of the powerful women who is the sister of the ruler at that time is Asma. And so in this poem of Asma, she also wrote a lot of books. You can see intercession. She says, "O Lord, cause us to enter into the salvation of the prophet for the sake of his rank, the best of mankind, Ahmad." Ahmad is the name of the prophet from the Quran because Jesus says there will be a prophet who will come to you whose name will be Ahmad. So this we sometimes said this Muhammad is the historical prophet, but Ahmad is the prophet in a way that is, for all times, because that name is in a way known before the historical. So here, we are praying to Allah to give us salvation through the intercession of the prophet. The second line says, "May we pass over the breach of Jahannam for the sake of the majesty of our prophet Muhammad." Again, because of the intercession of the prophet, make us go through that bridge. Save us on the last day from the fire with the dwelling of ease, paradise, for the sake of Muhammad. Right? And, O our Lord, may we behold your presence, the presence of the King of the Day of Judgment. Why? For the sake of Prophet Muhammad. So you can clearly see that even that teaching about spiritual unification comes through the Prophet. It's through him that we are able to enter into the presence of God. And I think I just wanted to mention two things in the contemporary Ismaili tradition. In the South Asian tradition, there is the Kinan, which says, "Unchati ayo, niche kyu diave." You have come from up high. Why do you sink so low? And then the refrain is, "Shafayat Rasulaki, Shafayat Paigambar." The intercession is of the messenger. The intercession is of the prophet. We're switching languages here, it's the same. And then in the daily prayer that we have for our tariqah, in one place we say, "Tawassalu aind al-masaib," which means seek to draw closer to God, and al-masaib, be Mawla, through your Mawla, through the intercession of your Mawla. So here you can see that you seek to go closer to God through the intercession of Mawla. I'm sorry, our English translation of the dua doesn't carry this. And another place in the dua where we say, "Allahumma ghafir lana dhunubana," set of prayers about forgiveness of sins or mercy. It says, "Bihaki." Bihaki means through the right of, or maybe through the intercession of, for the sake of, right, of the close prophets, for the pure imams and of our present imam. So intercession of the Prophet is really the grounds on which our notions of the intercession are based. So,
Yeah, that's excellent. We actually only have a few minutes left of the panel, so I will ask one more question. You've talked a lot about, the importance of intercession with the Prophet. I want to come back to this idea of the richness of the tapestry, and like how the Prophet is integrated in different cultures around the world.
so I can,
Let me jump quickly, because I think Ali, in his book that you have, Living Islam, speaks about two particular examples which I think are quite striking. One is the localization in the Bengal context, where the Prophet is read as the 10th avatar of Vishnu, as Naklanki avatar, and is understood in that context of fulfilling particular notions of cyclical history within an Indic context. And I'm very careful not to use the word Hindu, because I don't think that maps out quite as neatly. So really think about this in an Indic context, and then in a Sini context, in a Chinese context. The idea of the Prophet as being integrated into the Tao, or the Way, philosophical system within China, where the Quran is treated as the Han Kitab. Han is an ethnic community within the Chinese context. But really this, as opposed to the We, which is another Muslim community, another ethnic grouping, but within the Han context, the use of the Quran is the Han Kitab. So it becomes integrated into particular worldviews that don't, I would argue, do not water down or seek to transform the message of what the Prophet is saying, but to elevate it and make it legible in a different context where some of the reference wouldn't necessarily make sense. And I think we see this in other parts of the world, and Alnoor's queued up a few visual examples of this.
I just wanted to add to what you said, is that the Prophet in the Avatara context is also sometimes, particularly the South Asian Ismaili context, is seen to be similar to Brahma, while Ali becomes Vishnu counter. So you can see that even though this notion is found in the Bengali tradition, it's not just a South Asian Ismaili, but you see how, in a way, the Ismailis take it in a different direction for their own beliefs. Now I wanted to show you some examples of representation. And I want to begin with this particular image that you see. This is an image from a wonderful text which started out in Arabic and from the 13th century, and then was translated into Turkish. And once when the Ottomans became very wealthy, they decided to have this book illustrated. And so in Turkish, this is called Siyer al-Nabi, or Sirat al-Nabi in Arabic, which is the biography of the Prophet, and this is full of images. We're talking about 200 and lots of images. Now, this particular image that I'm showing you is about the Battle of Badr. And for those of you who are familiar with it, there was a large Meccan army. The Muslim army in Medina was small, and yet the Meccan army was defeated and turned back. And the Quranic reference to it says that we were there with you, aided you with angels. So if you look at this picture now, first of all, I think you can see it kind of represents, if you have any vague notion of what Islamic miniature art is, it probably falls within that category in some way. And you can see there's the Prophet in his green. That's the quite normal color for the Prophet in this particular manuscript. And you can see that his face is not being shown. This is very peculiar to that period, that time. We could look at other times when that is not the case, and to show you the diversity. And there is Angel Jibrail, coming to tell the Prophet what God's battle plans are. So you can see that's how the guidance is going here, how to move your soldiers around. Okay? But this is basically 16th century representation of the Battle of Badr based on the kind of accounts that are there. But you can see that the way the artist chose the colors and how to do it is really very local. For the Sultan is not going to, going probably off with his head if he's done a bad job. So he's very clear of what the Sultan wants, right? Now we switch to the 20th century. This is the Battle of Badr. This is from West Africa, from a Sufi group in Senegal called the Murid Order. And I think Professor Asani mentions it in his book. Now, the thing about this is, if you look at the characters in there, their characters are very, shall we say, south of the Sahara African, okay? And you can see that there are the angels up there. There is the prophet, his face is not shown on Burak, right? But very different kind, and I think, I don't know, if I had seen it in my younger days before I knew anything about Islam, I would never have thought this was Islamic art, right? And so that's, in fact, how do we define Islam? How we define Islamic art, how we define Islamic music, it's the same thing. Once you have this diversity, then you have to face with the factors. What does this teach me? What part of the tapestry does this teach? So I wanted to mention this to you, and I wanted to show you, because Jibril is not shown here. What does Jibril look like in this tradition? So I think I showed you, this is how Jibril is shown in this image with those wings and, characteristics. But in this tradition, it's an African Jibril. Okay? So this is what we call the localization and the naturalization of Islam to its environments. And this has been happening from day one. What we think of Iranian Islam, it actually began in the 7th century. And it has become so much a part of the way Islam is seen that we never think about it as different. But all of the lands where Islam has found a footing, the footing has been found by naturalizing it to its context. So this is, I think, the larger meaning of cultural studies. If we understand what it means to be Islam, not just in terms of imagery, but also in terms of ethics and so forth, that you can see how the local environment, the message of Islam, the prophet and his status all intervene together. And so here you can see Jibril. The prophet is not shown, his back is shown, but you can see the halo around the prophet, which looks like a golden, right? I hope you can see that. And the Burak is also very different here, but I won't go into very much. We have one image from this tradition we also want to show you.
No, sorry, before you move on,
Yeah.
let me just, I would just jump in for a second, yeah. So the man in the middle with face wrapped, and Alisha, sorry, I know you were conscious of time, so I'll be very quick, is a man named Sheikh Amadou Bamba. And Sheikh Bamba is the founder of this Murid order, the Sufi order, Senegalese Sufi order. This is based on the only known photograph of Sheikh Bamba. It is actually based on his prison photograph. He was arrested by the French in the early 20th century for resisting French colonial genocide in Senegal, because apparently it's criminal to resist genocide. So they put him in prison. They took this photo, and in the photo, his face is half hidden, his left hand is in shadows, his left foot is in shadows, and the Murids read it as Sheikh Bamba existing in the Zahir, in the visible, and the Batin, the hidden. That this photo represents his ability to walk between the Zahir and the Batin, between the visible and the hidden. And they talk about reproducing the images of Sheikh Bamba. They talk about it in the way Muslim calligraphers talk about the Quran, that it brings barakah, it brings these blessings, it brings God consciousness, taqwa, but that to have the image of Sheikh Bamba is to bring blessings into the environment where the image resides, is to ward off any harm or evil that might come to the person, and to remind people that the Sheikh is watching them and they should be living an ethical life, to the best of the ability as the Sheikh guides them. So this is very common within the awliya, the friends of God. You'll obviously, hopefully hear the parallels with this with other Sufi orders like the Bektashi, but also within various Shi'i communities who also use images of the Prophet and the Prophet's family to achieve some of the same ends.
Thank you so much both for a very insightful and, it was very informative discussion. I know there's a lot of takeaways here. I do want to, have some time for Q&A. So if there's any questions, we'll come around and start collecting them. This is a great opportunity to ask these brilliant minds any questions you might have on the subject, so please take advantage. This is an interesting one. So from calligraphy to music to poetry, artistic traditions have conveyed meaningful connection across Muslim societies. What makes art such a powerful lens for understanding Islam?
I mean, for me, this is something that I learned very much from Ali, which is, I think the Muslim traditions rely on art because so much of what it means to be a person of faith is trying to deal with the ineffable, the things that don't have words to describe them. And art specializes in articulating emotion where words fail. Even in lyrical poetry, we see, for example, Rumi often ends phrases, he gets to a point, he builds up, and then he goes, khamosh, silence. Because the words are no longer there, right? These visual representations rely on your knowledge of these stories, whether it's the Battle of Badr, as we saw here, or who Sheikh Bamba is. But the meaning you make of it is not told to you. It relies on you knowing the story to then make meaning of it in that moment, in that time. There's an Iranian tradition of what is called the fal. You do this, for example, I know this most often with Hafez, where you ask, you take the Divana Hafez, this poetry of this Persian poet, this collection of this poetry of this Persian poet, you ask a question and then you open the book to a page and the verse is meant to give you an answer, but obviously it's not a book of answers. You're meant to read meaning out of this. I've been told that this is common also on Laylatul Qadr for people to do this with the Quran now in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon and various Shi'i communities. So, the Quran is beautiful, and it is also full of verses that are clear and verses that are with hidden meaning, and so we turn to it in the same way, because it is about creating that affect, that emotion, taking our knowledge, meeting us where we are, and trying to figure out how we can better ourselves through that. So I think, for me, art is always that moment of transformation. It is always that invitation to transform, to think differently about something, to come at something diagonally. As the great philosophers Calvin and Hobbes say, it's about transmogrifying it. If anybody gets the Calvin and Hobbes reference, yes, it's about that transmogrification machine. So art serves that purpose.
Yeah, I was thinking of one of the things that Professor Asani mentioned. It's just a recitation of the Quran. And even in the Quran, are told that when the prophets of God heard the recitation of the Quran, they fell down, shivering and in prostration. So that the reciter who recites it well, their job, so to speak, is to be able to recite it to produce that reaction in us, the listeners. So that is their job. And our job as listeners is to be in that state, being able to receive the recitations to affect us. And I think that this is what art does. Art is not a straightforward representation. Art is one which, in a way, makes you see beyond the surface. And in a way, that's what the journey of faith is about. And so this is why when we're listening to a qawwali, there's a surface meaning. but we're drawing all kinds of meaning behind it. It's the same way music moves us. So I think that this is, there is a wonderful hadith in which it says, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. And that's what art is. It is that transformation and understanding the beauty around us and actually responding to it.
Thank you so much. I think that concludes the panel. Thank you so much for our panelists for sharing their insights, and to all of you for joining this conversation today. I know I've gleaned a lot from your insights, so thank you so much both for sharing so much wealth of knowledge. And I hope that you have a richer understanding of Muslims, and please purchase the book outside. At this point, I hand the discussion back over to our organizers for any final announcements, and thank you again for being with us this evening.
Thank you. What a rich and thoughtful, insightful conversation. Living Islam is a profound work that invites us to move beyond common misconceptions and explore the rich tapestry of Muslim life. It is a journey into many ways Muslims around the world understand and experience their faith, not just through theology, but through culture, art, and the everyday lived experiences. On the behalf of the organizing partners, I want to express our deepest thanks to our moderator, Alisha Kurji, for leading us so skillfully, and to our wonderful discussants, Dr. Alnoor Dhanani and Dr. Hussein Rashid, for sharing their expertise. And of course, our sincere gratitude goes to the author, Dr. Ali Asani, for writing such a necessary and beautiful book. At this point, I would like to invite Honorary Secretary, Ithra Fortrano Shalina Wali Muhammad, to come up to the stage and give a token of appreciation to our moderator and the panelists. Thank you, Ansak. I would request panelists and Alisha to please take their seats. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and a special thank you for everyone joining us live on the Smiley TV. We are delighted to share the release of the book with you all. My appreciation goes out to the tireless volunteers who made tonight run so smoothly. So thank you to our volunteers. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. And of course, thank you to Nora Valani for a beautiful and moving music that has set such a perfect atmosphere for the event. While we are done with the formal discussion, your journey with these ideas is just the beginning. There's no pop quiz today, but if you want to deeply engage in the concepts and subtly demonstrate your scholarly commitment, I encourage you to grab a copy tonight. This beautiful book, Living Islam, Muslim Expressions of Faith, is available to purchase. Please see the volunteers at the back. It has been an incredible evening and wonderful to see all your faces. Thank you so much. Good night. Allah Hafiz. Ya Ali Madad.